The military training base in Nevada was usually a quiet place after sunset, but tonight, something was different. The air felt heavier, the ground colder, and the silence sharper. Officers walked faster than usual, whispering to each other with a strange mix of curiosity and anxiety. It wasn't every day that a Hollywood action legend walked into a real military environment. Yet Steven Seagal did exactly that. He arrived without fanfare, wearing his signature long coat, tinted glasses, and a calm expression that never seemed to change. Most soldiers had only seen him in movies, breaking arms, flipping grown men, and ending fights with a single effortless move. But watching him walk through the base in complete silence, that felt different. This wasn't a movie. This was real life. Inside the main training hall, dozens of soldiers gathered around the mat, forming a loose circle. The hum of fluorescent lights echoed above them. The ground was padded, but the tension in the air was not. At the center stood General Rourke, a tall, broad-shouldered man known across the branches for his strict leadership style and explosive temper. His chest was lined with medals, his voice famous for shaking rookies to their core. Nobody knew why the general had taken such sudden interest in Seagal. Some said he wanted to test him. Others believed he simply didn't like civilians entering his territory. But one thing was clear. Something personal was brewing behind those cold, narrowed eyes. When Seagal finally stepped onto the mat, the room's noise dropped to zero. His movements were calm, almost too calm, hands folded, posture straight, breathing steady like still water. The general paced around him like a predator sizing up its prey. "You think your Hollywood tricks work on real soldiers?" General Rourke said in a low, taunting voice. A murmur spread through the audience. Nobody had dared speak to Seagal like that before. Seagal didn't reply. He simply lifted his chin, looking at the general as if he was staring right through him. That silence, that calm, irritated Rourke more than any insult possibly could. And then it happened. Driven by ego, pride, and a dangerously misplaced confidence, the general stepped in, grabbed Steven Seagal by the hair, hard, pulling his head downward. The room gasped. But that was the last moment where the general felt in control. Because what followed would leave the entire dojo frozen in stunned silence. For a moment after General Rourke's hand clamped onto Steven Seagal's hair, the entire training hall fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Every soldier, every instructor, every observer froze in shock. No one could believe what they had just seen. A highly decorated military general, known for his iron discipline and zero-tolerance attitude, had just crossed a line nobody else would dare even approach. He had put his hands on Steven Seagal. Seagal's head tilted slightly from the pull, but the rest of his body didn't budge. His posture remained upright, rooted, immovable, like a pillar that time itself couldn't shake. Behind his dark-tinted glasses, his expression didn't change. Not even a blink. That calmness was the first thing that rattled everyone. General Rourke tightened his grip as if trying to prove a point. "Well, what now, tough guy?" he sneered. But even those closest to him could see it. Seagal wasn't resisting. He wasn't flinching. He wasn't intimidated. He was waiting. A young private muttered under his breath, "Sir, he's not the one you want to grab." He was absolutely right. "Before we continue, tell me, which city and country are you watching from? Let me know in the comments." Back to the story. General Rourke gave another sharp tug, harder this time, trying to yank Seagal off balance. Still, nothing. It was like trying to pull down a mountain. Seagal slowly lifted his hand. Not in anger. Not in panic. Simply with intention. 2 fingers, just 2, rested lightly on the general's wrist. Rourke frowned, confused. And then it happened. With a smooth, circular motion so fluid it barely looked physical, Seagal peeled the general's fingers away from his hair. The movement was effortless, almost gentle, but the effect was immediate. The hold broke instantly, leaving Rourke unexpectedly off balance. Before he could react, Seagal stepped forward. His elbow rose. His hip rotated. His hand slid across the general's arm. The transition was a blur. And in the next heartbeat, General Rourke was airborne. A full-grown, heavily built, combat-trained general, lifted and flipped so fast that half the room didn't even understand what they were seeing. His boots lost contact with the ground, his body rotated through the air, and he crashed onto the mat with a thunderous boom that echoed like an explosion. Gasps rippled through the hall. Some soldiers took involuntary steps back. Others stared with their jaws hanging open. Steven Seagal didn't move. Didn't smile. Didn't strut. He simply stood there, calm, centered, breathing lightly, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Meanwhile, General Rourke lay on his back, stunned, blinking at the ceiling. The humiliation hit him harder than the throw. Seagal finally broke the silence. "General, never grab a man by the hair." Not loud, not aggressive, but the quiet authority in his voice was enough to chill the entire room. Rourke pushed himself up slowly, face burning. He wanted to shout, wanted to regain control, wanted to pretend nothing had happened, but everyone had seen it. Everyone. And his pride couldn't handle it. "You think that was something," he growled. "Let's see how you take a hit." Rourke stepped forward. His fist clenched. His shoulder rotated. The punch that followed was a full power strike, one he had used in countless drills to drop grown men to the floor. Fast, heavy, brutal. But Seagal wasn't there. He slid sideways, letting the punch cut through empty air. Rourke stumbled forward, caught off guard by his own momentum. Seagal placed a single hand on the general's back and guided him forward, lightly, almost politely. Rourke's feet tangled, and he dropped to one knee. Seagal's voice slid through the tension like a blade. "You're striking with anger. That is why you fall." That line stung Rourke more than any physical blow ever could. Breathing heavily now, the general got back to his feet. Sweat ran down his temples. He circled Seagal more cautiously this time. He lunged, trying to grab Seagal's arm. Seagal intercepted the wrist effortlessly, turning it outward and applying a joint lock so clean, so technical, that several soldiers flinched just watching it. Rourke's face twisted in pain as his knees buckled. Seagal did not finish the lock. He didn't break the wrist. He didn't throw him again. He simply controlled him, completely. "Relax," Seagal said, almost softly. Rourke couldn't relax. The pain forced him downward. Seagal released him gently, letting the general collapse onto the mat on his own. Rourke sat there, breathing hard, pride shattered. He had tried strength, intimidation, and aggression. None of it mattered. Only one truth remained. This wasn't a Hollywood stunt. Steven Seagal was the real deal. And the general had only experienced the beginning of the lesson. General Rourke remained on the mat longer than he intended. His breathing was uneven, his pride bruised far deeper than his body. Around him, the soldiers stood stiff, eyes darting between the general and Seagal, unsure what would happen next. On any other day, Rourke's authority dominated the room without effort. But today, that power had slipped through his fingers the moment he grabbed Seagal's hair. Seagal didn't move. He stood in the center of the mat, posture relaxed but presence overwhelming. He looked like a man waiting, not for a fight, but for a decision. A moment of truth. Rourke finally gathered himself and rose to his feet. His jaw clenched. His uniform was rumpled, one sleeve pulled out of place from the earlier lock. He stared at Seagal with a new expression, not pure anger anymore, but something mixed with confusion, disbelief, and a pinch of respect he wasn't ready to admit. He took one step forward. A captain whispered urgently from the sidelines, "Sir, maybe this is enough." Rourke ignored him. "Round 2, he said, trying to mask the tremble in his voice. Seagal tilted his head slightly, as if studying the general's intentions rather than his posture. "You sure you want to continue?" he asked, voice calm and low, without a trace of mockery. Rourke bristled. "I'm not done." The room tightened. Soldiers shifted nervously. This wasn't a sanctioned match. This wasn't a friendly demonstration. This was a man fighting to reclaim the authority he felt slipping away. Rourke raised his hands again, taking a more strategic stance this time, less aggressive, more controlled. He wasn't rushing in like before. He circled Seagal, testing angles, watching for an opening. But Seagal's stillness was unnerving. He didn't blink. He didn't shuffle. He didn't react. He simply listened, to the air, the floor, the energy in the room. Rourke attacked. A low sweep kick. This time, he didn't aim for a knockout. He aimed for balance, hoping to catch Seagal off guard, disrupt his footing. But Seagal shifted his weight with the precision of a falling leaf, letting the sweep pass harmlessly by. Instead of countering with brute force, he used the general's extended leg as a pivot point. He stepped in, placed a light hand on Rourke's shoulder, and redirected his center of gravity. Rourke stumbled forward again. Seagal didn't push. He didn't pull. He simply guided. The general caught himself, steadied, and came back stronger. He threw a flurry of quick strikes, jabs, elbows, and palm heel thrusts. This wasn't beginner-level fighting. Rourke was a trained soldier with years of close combat experience. His hands moved with speed and power, each strike sharp enough to cause serious damage to an untrained opponent. But Seagal wasn't untrained. To him, the barrage moved almost in slow motion. He parried each strike with minimal effort, tiny movements, barely visible to the untrained eye. A tilt of the wrist. A shift of the elbow. A subtle rotation of his shoulders. Rourke's strikes met nothing but empty air and redirected momentum. Frustration grew. Sweat dripped down Rourke's temples. Soldiers watching felt their own muscles tense with each failed attack. Some even winced when the general overextended and nearly fell again. Then it happened. Rourke launched a heavy elbow, his strongest strike yet. Seagal intercepted it instantly, placing both hands lightly on the general's arm. He absorbed the force, rotated his hips, and turned the strike into a spiral. The energy flipped backward, straight into Rourke. The general stumbled. Seagal stepped behind him, and with a controlled but decisive movement, he swept the general's legs out from under him. Rourke hit the mat again. Hard. The sound echoed like a gunshot. This time, Rourke didn't jump up immediately. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, breathing heavily. His chest rose and fell like someone who had sprinted a mile uphill. His face was flushed, his ego bruised beyond repair. The room stayed quiet. Too quiet. "Before I continue, what would you do if you were in General Rourke's position? Keep fighting or stop? Comment below." Back to the story. As the silence deepened, Seagal stepped back, giving the general space to rise. But there was no hostility in his posture. No triumph. No arrogance. Just patience. Rourke pushed himself up slowly, using his knee as support. He looked at Seagal with a mix of exhaustion and bewilderment. You're not human," he muttered. Seagal finally removed his glasses, revealing eyes sharp enough to cut through steel. "I'm just trained," he replied. "And you're relying too much on strength." That line hit Rourke harder than any throw. He knew it was true. His whole career, he had relied on power, rank, intimidation. But none of those things mattered to a man who had mastered the art of movement, the art of control, the art of not fighting force with force. Rourke inhaled deeply, wiped his forehead, and stepped back. He wasn't done, but he was no longer fighting Seagal. He was fighting himself. And that changed everything. This wasn't just a physical defeat anymore. It was the beginning of a lesson he never expected to learn. General Rourke stood again, but this time there was something different in his eyes. The earlier rage had faded into something quieter, something heavier. A man who'd always relied on strength and authority was now staring at a different world, a world where neither mattered, where skill and control ruled. Seagal remained motionless in the center of the mat. His posture was so relaxed that it seemed almost disrespectful, yet no one in the room felt disrespected. Instead, they felt intimidated by how naturally power radiated from him. It wasn't the power of rank. It was the power of mastery. The soldiers around the hall exchanged glances. They had witnessed military combat instructors, special operations hand-to-hand experts, and competitive fighters perform demonstrations. But what they were seeing from Seagal wasn't flashy, wasn't showy, and wasn't exaggerated. It was real, effortless, precise, controlled, and far deadlier than anything they had trained in. Rourke adjusted his uniform, trying to regain some of the dignity he'd lost. He circled Seagal slowly this time, observing instead of charging. All the reckless pride from before was gone. Now he was cautious, almost respectful. He took a steady breath. "All right, show me," he said. Seagal raised an eyebrow. "Show you what?" "The difference," Rourke said quietly. "I want to feel what I'm doing wrong." That sentence stunned the room. For a high-ranking general, one known for being unshakable, unbending, and unchallengeable, to ask to be taught, it was as shocking as the throws themselves. A murmur passed through the soldiers. Seagal nodded once. "Okay. Strike." Rourke stepped in with a controlled jab, nothing wild, nothing angry. A clean, tactical strike. Seagal met it smoothly, guiding the arm just a few inches off course. Before the general could pull back, Seagal tapped his elbow, shifted his stance, and suddenly, Rourke lost balance again. Not violently, not painfully, just with a gentle redirection that left him kneeling on one knee before he even realized his body had moved. He looked up, bewildered. How do you do that without force?" Seagal offered his hand to help him stand. The room gasped. No one had ever seen General Rourke accept help from anyone. Yet he did. Seagal explained calmly, "You're trying to overpower your opponent. I'm trying to understand him. Power isn't the weapon, awareness is." The soldiers leaned in. Even the instructors on the sidelines listened with full attention. Rourke dusted off his uniform. Again. He attacked with more precision, palm strike, elbow, a quick attempt at a grappling grab. His movements were sharp, the kind that could incapacitate most threats. But Seagal flowed around every motion like water bending around a stone. Rourke's elbow missed. His palm thrust was deflected. His grab dissolved into nothing. And then, with a simple pivot, Seagal stepped behind him and placed a hand on Rourke's spine. The general froze. "I haven't thrown you," Seagal said softly. "Notice that." Rourke nodded. "Because you're finally listening to your body instead of your ego." That line echoed through the hall. A humbling lesson, delivered without cruelty, without gloating, without dominance. Just truth. Rourke exhaled, long and slow. "Show me a real throw," he said quietly. Seagal studied him for a moment, ensuring the request came from learning, not ego. Then he nodded. "Okay. Try to grab me." Rourke stepped in with a firm grappling hold, one used in close-quarter combat to control an opponent's upper body. He locked onto Seagal's arm and shoulder. Seagal's response was almost invisible. A hip shift, a foot reposition, a slight drop in his center of gravity. Rourke lifted off the ground again. This time, however, the throw wasn't harsh. Instead of crashing, Seagal turned it into a smooth arc, guiding the general gently to the mat, placing him down with surprising care. The soldiers stared in awe. The throw was beautiful, fluid, efficient, controlled. It wasn't a takedown. It wasn't an attack. It was a demonstration of mastery. Rourke blinked up at the ceiling. That was actually kind of graceful. Seagal chuckled softly. Your body went where it wanted to go. I just stopped resisting it. When the general stood again, he didn't posture. He didn't tighten his fists. He didn't glare. Instead, he looked at Seagal like a student looks at a teacher. So all this time, I thought fighting was about dominance. Seagal shook his head. No. It's about connection. Dominance is what insecure men try to achieve. Masters don't dominate, they redirect. That line hit the entire room like a philosophy they'd never considered before. Rourke looked around at his soldiers. He could see the shock in their eyes. The questions. The awe. Then he looked back at Seagal and asked quietly, "Do you think I can learn this?" Seagal nodded once. Anyone who's willing to let go of ego can. The general swallowed hard, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he bowed his head slightly. Not out of fear, but out of respect. And the dojo fell silent for a completely different reason. General Rourke stood in the center of the mat, sweat running down his forehead, breathing heavier than he wanted the room to notice. His uniform, usually immaculate, was wrinkled, stretched, and marked with the imprints of several falls. But none of that embarrassed him as much as the truth settling in his chest. Steven Seagal wasn't showing off. Steven Seagal wasn't humiliating him. Steven Seagal was teaching him. And that truth was harder to swallow than any throw. The soldiers watching didn't dare move. Even the instructors, many of whom had decades of military combat training, stood with arms crossed, trying to hide their own shock. They weren't just seeing a demonstration. They were witnessing a man known for his unshakable authority get dismantled by someone who barely seemed to be exerting effort. Rourke lifted his chin, regaining his composure. "Again," he said. Seagal gave a slight nod. "As many times as you want, General." Rourke inhaled deeply, bracing himself. This time, he chose a tactic he knew well: forward pressure. He stepped in with measured aggression, hands up, body angled, weight low. It wasn't reckless, it was calculated. He aimed for Seagal's torso, attempting a controlled push to break balance. Seagal let the hands make contact. That alone surprised the room. Seagal wasn't avoiding, wasn't stepping away. Instead, Seagal absorbed the push. He dropped his center of gravity, softened his shoulders, and redirected the force downward with effortless timing. The general's momentum sank into the mat as if he had pushed against a swamp instead of a man. "You're strong," Seagal said. "But strength is only useful when it's not wasted." Rourke grunted, frustrated. "I'm not wasting it. He didn't finish. Because in the very next breath, Seagal slid a hand under Rourke's arm, pivoted, and turned the general's push against him. Rourke stumbled forward, off balance once again. Before he could fall, Seagal caught his jacket collar and redirected the motion into a soft roll. The general rolled across the mat and came up on one knee, more gracefully than expected, but still clearly outmaneuvered. "How?" Rourke asked, finally losing his composure. "How do you do that so fast?" Seagal answered calmly. "You keep trying to win. I'm trying to listen." Rourke stared at him, breathing hard. "Listen to what?" Seagal tapped the general's shoulder lightly. "To this. Your tension. Your fear of losing. Your anger. Everything you bring into the fight becomes part of your movement. And I just follow it." The room went silent. The soldiers didn't fully understand the mechanics behind Seagal's movements, but they understood one thing crystal clear. Rourke wasn't losing because he was weak. He was losing because Seagal had mastered a different dimension of combat. Rourke stood again, wiping sweat from his jaw. "All right," he said, voice steadier than before. "Then don't redirect this time. Hit me." A ripple of whispers shot through the room. Hit him. A real strike. Against a general? But Seagal didn't tense up. His face didn't change. "You don't want that," he said. Rourke stepped closer, eyes narrowed. "I need it. I need to know the difference between what you do and what we do." Seagal's expression softened, not in pity, but in understanding. "Fine," Seagal said. "But I won't harm you." Rourke raised his guard. "Do it." Seagal stepped forward. There was no dramatic wind-up, no heavy stance, no explosive motion, just a simple, controlled movement. Seagal reached out and tapped the general's chest with 2 fingers. Just 2 fingers. But the timing, the precision, and the placement were perfect. Rourke's entire body froze, an involuntary response. His breath seized. His stance collapsed. His legs buckled. He fell backward onto the mat, stunned, speechless. The soldiers gasped. Some stepped back instinctively. What did you just do to me?" Rourke managed, eyes wide. Seagal crouched beside him calmly. "I didn't hit you. I disrupted your balance. Your energy. You were tense from head to toe. That tension becomes a weak point." Rourke tried to sit up, but Seagal gently pressed his shoulder, keeping him down, not forcefully, just firmly. "You fight with aggression," Seagal said. "It makes you predictable." The general swallowed hard. "So you're telling me everything I've learned is wrong?" Seagal shook his head. "No. I'm telling you you've learned one side of the fight. I'm teaching you the other." Rourke exhaled, long and shaky. The fight wasn't humiliating anymore. It wasn't about dominance. It wasn't even about proving anything. It was about truth. A truth he had never considered. Slowly, the general stood, legs still unsteady, and faced Seagal with a different expression. No anger, no ego, no resentment. Just respect. And something else. A quiet fear of how much he still didn't know. The room watched silently, breath held, waiting for what lesson would come next. Because, for the first time, General Rourke wasn't leading the room. He was learning. The dojo was still trembling from the final moments of the fight. The throw, the reversal, the split-second silence after Steven Seagal dropped the general without even using strength. Students were whispering, some too stunned to blink, others trying to piece together what they had just seen. A man who walked in with arrogance, now sitting on the floor, gasping for breath, clutching his wrist as if reality had just hit him harder than Seagal's technique. But the story wasn't over. Because humiliation lands fast. Regret lands even faster. And consequences don't wait. The general, a man used to command, used to obedience, used to seeing fear in every eye that looked at him, slowly pushed himself up from the mats. The room watched him like a dangerous animal trying to stand after being sedated. His gray hair was messed up, his uniform wrinkled, and his ego shattered into 100 pieces. Seagal stood tall, calm, breathing like a man who had just finished a warm-up, not a confrontation. He didn't smirk. He didn't taunt. He didn't celebrate. He simply waited, hands folded behind his back, like a teacher waiting for a student to understand the lesson. The general finally rose. But something in his posture had changed. The stiffness was gone. The intimidation was gone. His face carried something the men under his command had never witnessed: embarrassment. "General," Seagal said softly, "you don't grab a man by the hair unless you're ready to face the consequence of that action." The whispering in the dojo turned into a heavy silence. Everyone felt the weight of those words, not as a threat, but as a truth. A truth the general had learned the hardest way possible. The general swallowed. His jaw tightened. His pride fought for control. He took one step forward. Every student tensed. But instead of trying to attack again, he bowed. A deep, respectful bow, the kind you only give when your soul is forced to admit something your ego never wanted to face. "I misjudged you," the general finally said. "And I misjudged this art." Seagal nodded once. Aikido isn't about domination. It's about control. Control of yourself first. The general exhaled slowly, realizing maybe for the first time in his life that strength isn't loud. Power isn't forced. And dominance isn't the same as discipline. His earlier actions, grabbing Seagal's hair, mocking the dojo, using rank to intimidate, all replayed inside his head, now looking unbelievably foolish. He could almost feel the regret physically sitting on his shoulders. Then Seagal stepped closer, speaking quietly so only the general could hear. "You didn't lose because you're weak. You lost because you thought respect was optional." The general closed his eyes. Because that line cut deeper than any throw. Around them, the students watched a transformation. A man who entered the dojo like a storm, now standing still like a humbled soldier learning his first lesson. For the first time, the general extended his hand, not to challenge, not to force, not to control, but to apologize. Seagal shook it, firm but calm. The moment felt bigger than a fight. Bigger than pride. It was the collapse of arrogance and the rise of understanding. Before I reveal what happens next, tell me in the comments. Would you have forgiven the general after what he did? Yes or no? The general turned to the class. The same faces he had intimidated only minutes earlier now looked at him with a new emotion, not fear, but surprise. He cleared his throat. "I came here expecting to prove a point," he admitted. "But instead, I became the point." Some students smiled. Others nodded. Seagal simply stood, arms folded, watching the shift inside the man. The general continued, "Strength without wisdom is dangerous. And I acted without either." The dojo didn't clap. Martial arts halls don't reward apologies with applause. Instead, they watched a rare moment they'd never forget, a powerful man owning his mistake. As the silence settled, Seagal spoke again. "General, the lesson isn't that you fell. It's that you stood up different." Those words lingered in the air like incense smoke. For the first time since entering, the general genuinely looked around the dojo, not as someone above it, but as someone who finally belonged to the idea of respect it represented. Then he said words no one expected. "If you allow it, I'd like to learn." The room froze. Even Seagal's eyebrow lifted slightly. "You want to train?" he asked. The general nodded. "I need discipline more than I need dominance." Seagal smiled, not a big smile, just enough to show approval. "Then the first lesson," he said, "is to bow to the mat, not because it's tradition, but because it reminds you to leave your ego outside." The general nodded. Slowly, deliberately, he bowed to the mat for the first time in his life. And in that small gesture, the dojo that had fallen silent earlier now felt alive with something new, respect earned, arrogance defeated, and a man transformed. The training hall had returned to a quieter rhythm, but the echoes of the confrontation still lingered. Soldiers moved carefully across the mats, whispering to each other in awe, still processing the impossible sequence they had just witnessed. A four-star general had walked in with arrogance, grabbed Steven Seagal by the hair, and ended up humbled in front of his entire team. Even those who had trained under him for years couldn't stop talking about it. Everyone understood it wasn't just about skill, it was about mastery, control, and the quiet authority that comes with experience, patience, and awareness. By the time the hall emptied, stories were already spreading through the base. Word of the general's mistake traveled faster than any drill or military announcement. Within hours, footage of the encounter, captured on a few soldiers' phones, found its way to the base's internal network. By the next morning, clips had leaked online, and the incident went viral. Social media erupted. Watch the general who grabbed Steven Seagal and got schooled in seconds. Legendary Aikido master versus military ego. You won't believe what happens. This isn't acting. This is real control. The comments poured in from across the world. Soldiers, martial artists, and ordinary people all praising Seagal's calm, dignity, and skill. Some wrote about lessons in humility. Others shared how they had been bullied or underestimated and felt inspired. The incident became more than a fight. It became a story about respect over ego, skill over brute force, and mastery over arrogance. Back at the dojo, the general sat quietly, reflecting on what had happened. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by the lingering weight of realization. He had underestimated a man based on appearance and reputation. He had assumed strength and authority would always win. And in that assumption, he had been humbled in the most public way possible. Seagal approached, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. The general returned it, a gesture heavy with respect and understanding. There were no words, none were needed. The lesson had been learned. True power comes from control, not domination. Respect is earned, not demanded. Over the next few weeks, the general took his first steps toward redemption. He began training under Seagal's guidance, learning to temper strength with awareness, and to replace arrogance with control. Soldiers noticed the change immediately. He no longer barked commands from a place of ego. Instead, he led with patience, understanding, and humility. And the difference in the dojo's atmosphere was palpable. Meanwhile, the online attention continued to grow. The video clips amassed millions of views, shared not just for the spectacle, but for the message. Martial artists, trainers, and even military personnel praised the incident as a rare example of discipline, respect, and skill teaching a lesson without cruelty. Seagal's calm dominance, paired with his refusal to humiliate the general unnecessarily, became a textbook example of mastery in practice. The story even inspired challenges and discussion around the world. Could you maintain control under provocation? And how would you react if someone tried to humiliate you? People shared, debated, and learned. The narrative went far beyond a single dojo. It became a lesson in life. Finally, Seagal addressed the dojo and the online audience together. Strength is only one part of the equation. Ego will destroy your skill faster than any opponent. Respect is earned, not forced. Control yourself, and you control everything around you. And with that, the story ended, not with a punch, a throw, or a fall, but with the quiet power of discipline, dignity, and humility. The general, once arrogant, now a student, looked at Seagal and simply said, "Thank you for teaching me the hardest lesson I've ever learned." The dojo stayed silent for a moment, then filled with nods of respect from soldiers who had witnessed a transformation. And across the world, millions of viewers echoed the same sentiment online. Respect is power. Humility is mastery. Steven Seagal taught it perfectly. If you believe respect and skill outweigh ego, type respect in the comments and subscribe for more real-life lessons and inspiring stories like this one.